Hello and welcome to Spotlight. As Israel's genocidal war on Gaza continues, with full support from the United States, the two allies have not backed down from carrying out acts of terrorism in the West Asia region. Only in recent days, the Israeli regime has assassinated two important figures of the region's resistance front in operations in Syria and Lebanon. And Washington has also shown its disrespect for other nations' sovereignty by conducting a deadly drone strike on the headquarters of Iraq's popular mobilization units in Baghdad. We'll try to bring to the spotlight the ramifications of Washington and Tel Aviv's acts of terrorism in tonight's show. We have DeBar, activist and commentator, joining us from Austin, New York. And academic and commentator Daniel Shaw. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. DeBar in Austin. We're going to kick off this segment with the recent terror attack in Kerman. In your opinion, who benefits from such deplorable acts and from attempts of creating this type of insecurity in the region?
I mean, the thing was done on speculation, okay? There's an expectation that this act will create that effect. The question is, of course, who did it and what did they intend? Pretty clear it was the U.S. or Israel, the intent to create instability in Iran, to provide some sort of domestic satisfaction for people in Israel who are looking at Iran through the propaganda, machinery there as an enemy or the enemy. And so, you can tell who benefits, basically, if they benefit by what happens. Well, several things could happen. Iran shows, in fact, that it's a stable country, which it is, and it, hunkers down and deals with the effects of this and makes a counter move that, is satisfactory to the people in Iran, and also a satisfactory lesson, perhaps, of the cost of doing these things to Israel and or the United States. The other is that they're successful and somehow it creates instability in Iran. I doubt that's going to happen, though, because Israel is on a much weaker foundation than Iran. The people of Iran are sitting on land that they've been on, going back to the Persian Empire. And the people of Israel are sitting on land that they've been in since the late 19th century from Europe, and surrounded by enemies that they've created by inserting themselves into the middle of this region. So I don't think the intended effect is going to, express, and I think it's pretty clear who did it and why.
Daniel Shaw, regardless of who was behind this attack, many analysts that we've spoken to here on PressTV see the Israelis as having a role in the terror attacks. And it's not unprecedented, of course, for the Israeli regime. What do you think?
I agree with Mr. DeBar. The same way that U.S. imperialism has used Israel since 1948 as a proxy force to do its dirty work in the area against the Lebanese, against the Syrians, against the Iranians, against the Palestinians, first and foremost, as they carry out a genocide. Likewise, they have used ISIS. Jake Sullivan's infamous quote from 2015 when he said that ISIS were not the State Department's enemies in Syria. How many times have they, and this is what WikiLeaks and all of those cables, and that's why Julian Assange and others are in exile or in jail, because they were able to shed light on this topic. Because what the U.S. wants to try to do with their war propaganda is wipe their hands clean of what happened about some 60 hours ago in Tehran. There's nothing that can convince us that it wasn't the Mossad and the Central Intelligence Agency, which has an undisclosed budget. It's an unvouchered budget, meaning they don't have to leave any paper trail for all of their dirty work around the years. A budget somewhere in the range of $50 billion per year for the CIA. And this is right up their alley. They strike one day in Beirut, they strike the next day in Tehran, and then they strike in Baghdad. The arrogance of this empire and of Zionism is almost unparalleled in history.
Don DeBar, looking at the recent Israeli attacks in the region, the assassination of the Iranian military advisor Sayed Razi Mousavi in Syria, Hamas senior official Salah al-Aruri in Lebanon, are these Israeli attempts at expanding their onslaught on Gaza into a wider regional conflict and maybe trying to get the United States more directly involved?
The individual actors have, their individual motivations. Netanyahu, first of all, has his own personal motivations, which is basically a single one: stay out of prison. He has to stay in office in order to stay out of prison. He is sitting on top of a coalition where he's really not the leading partner, and he's become a liability even to them over his handling of this entire affair. And then there is the interests of the state of Israel, quote unquote, whatever elite that actually is in terms of making and expressing policy. There's certainly the geopolitical interests of the United States, which Israel is a proxy for. They refer to it as an aircraft carrier and whatever, a battleship. And behind that, even, the oil companies, basically, that have a large chunk of the stock of the U.S. government. So we're looking at a war over the resources there, and over not just the oil and gas and those resources, and not even just the human resources, but also the geographic resources. The location itself is an important strategic asset in fighting Russia and China, which is also part of perhaps their ultimate goal. So looking at how these things are playing out here. Clearly, you look to what the interests of the U.S. and of Israel as its local partner are, and how these things fit into it. I think that, again, you consider the fact that there's a war going on, not the war that began, quote unquote, on October 7th, and not even the war that began with the Nakba in 1948. This is the war that's been going on since imperialism came to that part of the world to try to, and for a long period of time, to have seized the resources or control of the resources there. You're looking at the British changing the form of imperialism in 1948. In the face, though, of Mossadegh coming to power and the Iranian people really taking control of their fate up until the CIA coup in 1953, and then Nasser and first the construction of Egypt and Syria and Iraq, which was coming on. You were going to see a united Arab Republic across the Arab world. Again, another anti-imperialist rise. The war that took all of those things down, and then has saw a reversal with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, is ongoing, and this is just another battlefield in that entire, in that larger war.
Right, Mr. Shah, regarding the assassinations, Hezbollah leader Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah earlier today said that the blood of the martyrs of the resistance will not go in vain, and he also said that the killing of Salah al-Aruri will not go unpunished. There were similar comments from Iran regarding the assassination of Razi Mousavi in Syria. Are these actions producing the results that Israel and the U.S. were seeking, or are they, in the words of Hassan Nasrallah, further igniting the resistance front in the region?
First off, it's very clear that Israel is a Western imperialist creation. It's a Frankenstein. But is this Frankenstein slipping out of the control of their very handlers, of the Dr. Frankenstein that called them into existence? It seems that the U.S. does not want the upper summits of the U.S. ruling class. Do they really want a war with Iran, a nation of almost 100 million people, a rich civilization that goes back millennia? They can't handle the economic rise of China. Russia is whipping their behinds in this NATO-U.S. proxy war against Russia, with the Ukrainian people trapped in the middle. Do they really want to open up another massive front against the Iranians, against the axis of resistance? But there can be no doubt that there's an Israeli and a U.S. hand behind these terrorist bombings in Tehran. They bomb into Iraq. They bomb into Syria. They bomb the Syrian airports in Aleppo and in Damascus. They bomb the militias, the anti-imperialist militias in Iraq. They bomb at will. So the Israelis and the U.S. are, in a very cavalier way, they're inviting the resistance to strike back. Of course, it's the military-industrial complex that runs the media in this country. And what we saw yesterday at about 2 p.m. was the most synchronized statement from the New York Times and the BBC and the Israeli Times and Haaretz washing their hands clean as if the West had nothing to do with these terrorist bombings. But there's an abundance of proof. We have to read the Gray Zone, and we have to read Aaron Mate in the geopolitical report and these other outlets who've been tracking ISIS and their handlers from Benghazi in Libya to the ports of Turkey, back through Syria. WikiLeaks revealed this Israeli-U.S. ISIS nexus. Now, yesterday when they made that statement, of course, liberals across the U.S. and everyday U.S. people thought, this is surely a Shiite, Sunni dynamic. But it's important to ask, at the moment of the ultimate Muslim unity, of pan-Arab and Muslim unity in defense of the people of Palestine who are up against the genocide,
right,
who benefits from this terrorist bombing?
Don DeBar, the resistance front in Iraq, it continues to put pressure on the U.S. administration with its anti-Israeli and anti-U.S. operations. But Hassan Nasrallah earlier said that following the recent targeting of a leader of the popular mobilization units in Baghdad, Iraqi politicians now have a historic opportunity to expel all U.S. forces from Iraq. Now let's go rewind to the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Iran also said that one way of avenging his death would be the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region. How close are we to seeing that day?
I forget what the official count is, 2,500, I think, or supposedly. You know, recent events have actually, exposed the fact that the U.S. still occupies Iraq. You know, occupation is a fact, not necessarily, a set of individual situations. For example, if the United States is exercising control at gunpoint of the, the nation state or policy making of Iraq, whether they have a million troops there or two, the occupation is an occupation. The fact that it's still occupied has been, again, exposed by the recent events there and the attacks on the U.S. Military assets by the Iraqi forces and by the Iraqi people. One of the things that gets sort of obfuscated in conversation about these matters is the word terrorism. I mean, we're talking about warfare, okay? Terrorism is a term that came into usage when there were articles or acts of warfare committed by either non-state actors or by the other in terms of propaganda. In fact, and it's even more complicated given the sort of the political, legal political situation that exists on the ground in that region and in a number of other post-colonial regions. You have contradictions between the states themselves that are former colonial states and some semi-colonial states now. And you have contradictions in some cases, like in Saudi Arabia, between the population that's there and the the government, particularly in terms of relations with the United States and Israel. And so, if you lose all these other terms that are the popular ones and think of it in strategic terms, in terms of warfare, you have the populations the population of the nations around Israel, around Palestine, that are all in favor of protecting the Palestinian people and adamant about this. And now witnessing like the worst genocide, certainly since there have been TV cameras to record it in human history, and their governments debating at the United Nations about it, and finally one nation submitting a claim at the ICJ. There are a lot of those contradictions that are going to be resolved over the course of this, whatever conflict. And I think in some of the more reactionary states, you're going to see the governments change, including, I don't mean just the individuals in the government, but the nature of the governments in relation to people change. And that is going to happen under conditions of active warfare, in a number of these states and what they call the state of Israel. And so it's difficult to predict what's going to happen, other than if some way isn't found to put this fire out and to provide justice and safety for the Palestinian people. It's going to be a bloodbath there.
Daniel Shaw, the Yemeni armed forces continue targeting Israeli-linked ships and vessels bound for the occupied territories, despite the formation of the U.S.-led naval coalition in the Red Sea and Washington's threats and warnings. Tell us more about this defiant message that the Yemenis are sending to the U.S. and its allies, as they've been clear these attacks will persist until Israel ends its crimes against Gazans.
All of humanity has Yemeni people with who we call in the West the Houthis, these forces of resistance. I mean, this is a small country of only 30 million people, and to stand up to empire and their Zionist underlings is extremely impressive. And this is on the heels of over 7 years of a horrific U.S. proxy war, of using the Saudis to really wage a campaign of starvation, of horrific bombing against the Yemeni people. This was horrific violence that we almost never learned about here in the United States. And now they're doing the same thing to the Palestinian people. The U.S. has almost single-handedly destroyed Iraq, destroyed Syria through a covert, dirty war. They've dismembered and destroyed Libya. And a big part of the foreign policy establishment wants to Iraqi-ize or Libya-ize or Syria-ize Iran, one of the strongest countries in the region, and the spearhead of this axis of resistance, which counts among its cadre the Yemenis, the Iraqi militias, Hezbollah. There's no question that Israel wants every excuse, every pretext to continue bombing the daylights out of their neighbors. But as Mr. DeBar has indicated, there's a half a billion Arab people in the Arab world watching on, 8 billion members of humanity watching this horrific Holocaust of the Palestinian people. So when would Israel ever have peace with its neighbors when for 75 years they've treated their neighbors with genocidal violence?
Sure. Don DeBar, in spite of all the efforts to weaken the resistance in the region, why is the resistance front still thriving?
This is what human beings do. We don't die easily. Any of us, as a group, as individuals. It's in our nature to try to live. It's the way this thing is taking shape is an unusual, historically unusual methodology being expressed. It's kind of like at an individual, national or regional level, where you would have a guerrilla war as a revolutionary spear. Only this is the falling together of those aspects of the various nation states in the area that see the emergency that has to be addressed, and rolling up their sleeves and going to do it. Any one of these individual states declares war on Israel, the United States, and Israel focus their whatever the power they have, their militaries on that to make an example of them in front of the others. That's their traditional model. Looking to the Vietnamese war, or the American war as they call it in Vietnam, the resistance there was not conventional resistance. And this that we're seeing develop here is an unconventional resistance also, kind of that sort of model that may well produce some unexpected results that they hadn't planned on in the Pentagon or in Langley or wherever whatever rat hole they make these plans on in the so-called state of Israel.
Daniel Shaw, final question for you as well. Why is the resistance front still thriving in the region in spite of all the efforts to weaken it?
Ho Chi Minh said no amount of modern war technology could defeat people's will to be independent. This is about sovereignty. This is about indigenous dignity. the U.S. and Israel would have to wipe every last Iranian, every last Arab, every last Alawite, every last Kurd off of the face of the earth. People are going to continue to resist. And how could we ever forget the chief of the Mossad as well, who said publicly that al-Nusra Front, that the worst terrorist outfits operating in the Syrian theater and the Iraqi theater were allies of the Israelis and deserved compassion. And he said this publicly on Al Jazeera. So we have an abundance of proof that the Israelis and the U.S. have indeed kept Al-Qaeda and ISIS on a short leash, and this is something that the American public has to look into closely, as well as the Western world.
Mr. DeBar, I saw you nodding there. Would you like to share with us your final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think citing Ho Chi Minh, as Dan just did, is exactly appropriate.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Activist and commentator Don DeBar joining us from Ossining, New York, and also from New York academic and commentator Daniel Shaw. Gentlemen, thank you for contributing to our program, and also a special thanks to you, our viewers, for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.